thanks to the Asia Society Policy Institute for inviting me to be a part of this conversation today. I'm really looking forward to talking with Puneet about this timely and well done report, and I'd encourage all of those tuning into the event to read it if you haven't done so already during or after the program. As Tom mentioned, this is an interactive event. Please send your questions via YouTube chat or Facebook comment. We'll try to get as many of them in as we can over the next hour. So let's get started. Puneet, I think you and I would agree that Iran is the most serious national security challenge facing the United States in the Middle East. All the difficult issues we deal with there, Syria, Yemen, Israeli-Palestinian issues, security in the Gulf, all get a lot harder if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. You've been looking at this issue, you've worked this issue for a long time, you've just written about it with this report. Why don't you tell us a little about the report and the recommendations you're advising for U.S. policy on Iran?
Sure. Thanks very much, Andrew. So I'll begin by describing where we are today. The Trump administration 2.5 years ago basically made the decision to pull the United States out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and to reimpose tough sanctions on Iran, particularly on its oil sector. In that time frame since then, in the interim, Iran has essentially shortened its breakout time to a nuclear weapon, probably from well over a year under the JCPOA to probably somewhere down to a handful of months, 3-4 months or so now today. It's become a lot more aggressive in the region as well. We've seen a number of activities and attacks directed at oil, in particular in the Persian Gulf region, in Saudi Arabia, oil shipping in the Persian Gulf itself, as well as attacks against American forces in Iraq by Iraqi Shia militia who are closely aligned with Iran. And the two countries themselves, Iran and the United States, have actually come close to conflict on 3 occasions in 2019 and 2020. And I'd add to that the United States also finds itself isolated from its closest allies, especially over this question of its withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So that's where we find ourselves. And in my report, I lay out the key sources of tension between the United States and Iran. These include, obviously, the nuclear program, which you referenced, as well as tensions in the region. I take a look at the important role that domestic politics plays in each country, and it's an important backdrop that can never be ignored in this relationship. Then, based on my experience working on Iran policy during the Obama administration, I try to sketch out 4 different potential scenarios for the United States and Iran, in particular US policy towards Iran. The first is what I call a strategy of selective or cautious engagement, if you will. Second is a continuation of the status quo that we have today. A third is the possibility of military escalation. And a fourth scenario, which is less likely admittedly, involves a grand bargain between the two countries. And I think it's important to go through this mental exercise because I find that it helps to take us out of the realm of abstraction and to really bring to the surface the pros and cons of the different policy choices that we face and to make them a lot more tangible so that you can make more informed decisions. And so based on that, I offer 10 specific recommendations for US policy, and I'll run through those quickly. The first is to prioritize the nuclear issue, given everything we're facing, and you mentioned several of the issues there, including regional questions. The nuclear issue really rises to the surface, given the consequences an Iranian nuclear weapon would have for American security, for global security for that matter, and the global non-proliferation regime. The United States, I argue, should make clear that we're going to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. I argue that if Iran returns to compliance with the JCPOA, that the US should re-enter the agreement as well. An alternative, if that doesn't happen, would be to reach an agreement, an interim agreement with Iran, which would involve some degree of restraint on Iran's nuclear activities to pull us back from the brink in exchange for some sanctions relief. And then the two sides could use that cooling off period, if you will, to begin to negotiate a broader agreement in consultation with the other members of the so-called P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council in Germany who negotiated the initial JCPOA with Iran. I believe that the world would welcome either of those alternatives. And I think that we should use the goodwill from that to seek to broaden the terms of the JCPOA. This could include things like extending sunset clauses or bringing in new elements as well. Iran has said that it wants compensation from the United States for the losses it incurred during this period that the United States pulled out of the agreement and reimposed sanctions, while Iran argues that it was still in some degree of compliance with the agreement. I think it needs to understand that compensation is going to be off the table. It won't happen. But nonetheless, once diplomatic contact is reestablished with Iran, I argue that the two sides should explore other topics. And you should probably begin with areas where there's a lot of mutual interest. Subjects like Afghanistan come to mind in terms of one place where there may be some degree of overlapping interest between the two countries. But the mere fact of a diplomatic channel, I think, would be a positive development because it can be used to help diffuse the tensions that frequently arise in the relationship. I also argue that the two sides should make humanitarian gestures. Iran should release American citizens that it's holding unjustly. The US should also ease sanctions on aid that prevents Iran from getting COVID-19 related assistance. It's just the right thing to do. And I also argue that the United States should ease and end actually the Muslim ban, so-called Muslim ban, which prevents the entry of Iranians amongst others to the United States. Earlier this month, the UN arms embargo on Iran expired. And I argued that we should use diplomacy with Russia and China in particular to continue a de facto arms embargo, particularly on the import of major weapon systems by Iran. Exports of Iranian arms are covered by existing bans, at least as it relates to Yemen and Hezbollah. Of course, Iran routinely violates those bans, but nonetheless, it's important that those are there, at least de jure. To get at that issue, though, of what Iran is doing in the region, I argue that the U.S. should carry out interdiction operations, use targeted sanctions, and bring Europe along into that effort as well. But I think it's important to recognize that Iran's regional activities don't take place in a vacuum. Iran's Quds Force exploits the weaknesses in fragile states and in conflicts throughout the region to really extend their influence. So one of the best ways to counter them is through more active American diplomacy in the region. So things like strengthening the Iraqi central government, supporting a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, helping the Lebanese on reform, helping Arab countries more broadly on economic and political reform, and can really help to weaken the pull of extremists and to cut off the avenues that Iran exploits to make mischief. Another recommendation I make is that we should support human rights in Iran, and that record is pretty abysmal. But I argue that we should distinguish any effort on human rights from any confusion with regime change. I think it's important that that distinction be maintained. Finally, I argue that a bipartisan U.S. approach, a bipartisan consensus in the United States is really important to making Iran policy more effective. So in sum, I'd say that sanctions alone are not going to work on Iran. They need to be coupled with a realistic diplomatic offer. They have to be backed by a broad international consensus. And those two elements are missing today. And I'd say that diplomacy does not mean capitulation. It's just one method to pursue your interests. And it doesn't stand alone. It has to be complemented with other tools. So why don't I stop there, Andrew? We can go to questions.
Puneet, you put a lot out there, and thank you for that presentation to get us kicked off. And again, to our viewers, YouTube chat, Facebook comments, however you're engaging with us today, please send your questions along and we'll try to get them in. Let's talk about diplomacy. You have some experience with that. President Trump has made clear that he's ready to talk with Iran about a new Iran agreement. Obviously, Iran doesn't want to talk about a new deal. They want to return to the JCPOA. But last year at the UN Security Council, President Trump, working with French President Macron, tried to arrange a meeting with President Rouhani. And in advance of that, there was some discussion of an interim or limited relief for Iran to some sanctions issues. That never came together. President Trump believes in direct diplomacy at the summit level. He argues that his relationship, for example, with Kim Jong-un has held off a conflict in the Korean Peninsula, that relations were bad before he established that relationship. If you could talk about this in a specific sense of how to engage Iran at this specific time. Do you start at the top by dealing with Rouhani? Do you reestablish foreign ministry channels, or are there other ways you would proceed?
Well, thanks very much, Andrew. Based on my own experience in the Obama administration working in this file, diplomacy, and having watched this issue for a number of years, as you have, you know that diplomacy with Iran is never easy. I mean, the two countries, the United States and Iran, haven't had relations formal relations since the Islamic Revolution, 1979. In many ways, the regime's ethos in Iran is built on opposition to the United States. It's even though revolutionary fervor has died down somewhat over the years, it still animates many of the regime's leaders and many of its hardcore supporters. And so sitting down with the United States is not a prize. You referenced North Korea. For North Korea, sitting down with President Trump was basically legitimized them. It was seen as a positive. It helped put North Korea have it be seen at the same level as the United States. And that's not at all what Iran is looking for. Again, the regime has this enmity towards the United States built into its DNA. And so sitting down with the United States is a difficult act for them. And so we, in the Obama administration, did reach out at the top. President Obama wrote to the Supreme Leader early on in the administration, and eventually we were able to sit down first in a secret channel in Oman. That began when Jake Sullivan and I went over there together to meet with the Iranians, and the discussions were very difficult. We actually didn't reach an understanding on a way forward initially. We kept at it in early 2013, and then when President Rouhani was elected in 2013, things began to move much more quickly. It was almost like a light switch had been turned there, and the Iranians got a lot more serious, and we were able to move more quickly on our nuclear negotiations. And so you do have to have some degree of top cover, but I think the Trump administration, President Trump in particular, may not fully appreciate just how difficult it is for Iran to do these things. They are not looking for a photo op or a spectacle of the kind that you saw at the DMZ or in the Singapore summit. To them, that's actually kind of anathema. They would rather do the quiet diplomacy. If they have to interact with the U.S., they will to a certain degree. But big summits without achievements in their mind are very difficult for them to do, and that's why it's easier for them to deal with the United States in the P5+1 format, where you have a number of world powers together. You have the UN framework. Under the Bush administration, we actually had the United States had discussions with Iran on Afghanistan. But a lot of that took place, again, either through the UN format or in the context of the Bonn Conference, which brought a lot of countries together. So that gives you a flavor for the kinds of hesitations and if you will, the history, the baggage that Iran comes with.
Puneet, it's interesting. We had a conversation on one of our Al Monitor podcasts recently with Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who has also negotiated directly with Iran in the past, former ambassador to Iraq and Afghanistan. So he's also dealt with these issues. And when I asked him about how to proceed now with diplomacy, I was taken with his answer that the first step is not a direct negotiation with Iran, but it's rebuilding that consensus you talked about with our European allies. And then also, which leads me into my next question for you about Russia and China. Now, they're also signatories to the JCPOA. I think their acquiescence is essential to a new deal with Iran. But presently in our politics and our foreign policy, there's lots of bad blood with both of those countries, including with Russia over interference in US elections. How do you see, now it's never easy to deal with Russia and China, but the Obama administration got them on board for the JCPOA. How should the next administration, Trump or Biden, proceed in terms of Russia and China?
Sure, and I'll get to that. And it's good that you referenced this consensus, and I very much agree with Ambassador Crocker. In fact, he was one of the ones who carried out some of that diplomacy I referenced during the Bush administration. So he knows what he's talking about. And that consensus with Europe, our closest allies in Europe, is the bedrock from which other diplomacy flows, whether it's with Iran or, as you mentioned, with Russia and China. You begin with that bedrock, and then you move to Russia and China. Now, when it comes to those two countries, you're right. That is actually going to be a challenge. Relations with both countries are difficult right now. They're not where they were several years ago when we first began this process in P5+1. But I think that it's still worth the effort, and it's important to remember where the common ground lies with Russia and China, and that's basically that neither of them want to see Iran with a nuclear weapon. So you begin with that basic strategic common ground with Russia and China, and you have to then tailor your policy to that particular set of issues. Russia does not want a nuclear weapon in the hands of Iran on our southern border. China as well would find that destabilizing. They don't want another country in the nuclear club. And so you begin with that, and you actually find that you can actually do a lot with that. Now, they may both have strategic interests in the Middle East that they want to further through a relationship with Iran. They want to China in particular, when it looks at Iran, sees an important segment of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's looking to build a comprehensive strategic partnership with them. Russia as well, more on the strategic military side, has built relations with Iran. But still, at the end of the day, neither country will tolerate Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon. And that actually gives you a lot to build on. And we used that in the Obama administration. I remember spending a lot of time with my colleague, Mike McFaul, who later became ambassador to Russia. And when he was at the National Security Council, he and I spent a lot of time coordinating about how we would basically make Iran a key element of the reset with Russia. And it actually, Russia played a very positive role. And even when relations had started to deteriorate with Putin's return, Russia still, according to my colleagues who were still involved in the negotiations at the end, continued to play a constructive role. And the Chinese as well, when they wanted to get Iran's notice, they could do it. They were typically the quietest ones at the negotiating table, but when they said something to Iran, Iran perked up and listened to what they had to say. So I think that same core interest in preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon exists, and we should build from that.
You know, I also think, listening to what you say, that another advantage in terms of rebuilding the European consensus, making another stop in Moscow, another stop in Beijing, also gives time for Iran to assess what's happening. And let me put it another way. I don't know if the U.S. needs to be seen as in a rush to negotiate directly with Iran, especially when there's other diplomatic stops to be made before one ends up dealing directly with the Iranians. And that's especially the case given the uncertainty around Iranian politics right now. As you'd mentioned, your talks with the Iranians picked up when President Rouhani came in. Well, President Rouhani is out of office as of next year. The Trump administration's withdrawal from the JCPOA and the decline in Iran's economy that's resulted from that. They now are facing their third straight year of negative economic growth. That's compounded, of course, by COVID-19 and low oil prices. So the JCPOA is now a loser in Iranian politics. It was a winner at one point, and Rouhani's stature and credibility has been hurt because of what's happened. And the Iranian parliament now has a number of conservative figures, and who knows how Iranian politics is going to shape up over the next year. You talk a little about the Iranian situation. Do you want to add a little to that and tell us a little more about what you expect on the Iranian side if negotiations were to commence?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. And I completely agree with your assessment, Andrew, of the dynamics at play in Iran. I think that the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA really damaged the standing of reformist figures in Iran. Now, when a lot of people look at Iran, they say, well, moderates, hardliners, there's no such thing. That it's basically they're all the same. And it's easy to come to that conclusion. And certainly there are common elements that they all share. But I would argue that there are differences between the so-called reformers and the hardliners. The reformers really believe that the system has to change internally in terms of increasing participation from the public, increasing social freedoms, and they're more open to compromise with the United States. The hardliners very much, as their name suggests, cling to an originalist view, if you will, of the Islamic Republic, and they think that only by maintaining that fidelity to the founding principles of the Republic can the Republic actually survive. And the hardliners for sure are ascendant. There's no question in my mind. They've grown even more powerful, though, I would argue, with the policy moves that the United States has made, which has really hurt the credibility of the reformers. And I'd argue that the sanctions as well have played into their hands. Iran as a whole is weaker, but when you look at it in relative terms, the public is even weaker than the country, has gotten weaker. Because a lot of the, there have been protests over the last 2 years that we've seen. A lot of those actually people ascribe that to some observers to the heightened expectations that arose with the JCPOA, and expectations that people had for things to get better. And while at a macro level, Iran's economy began to improve, a lot of people weren't feeling that. And in many ways, it revealed a lot of the shortcomings, the corruption, the structural deficiencies in the Iranian system. And a lot of people became upset with that, and they expressed that anger on the streets. Now, Iranians really are just trying to survive. The middle class is shrinking. You have more people sinking into poverty. People are focused more on their day-to-day existence and not on their government shortcomings. And meanwhile, the hardliners, particularly those associated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, they're the ones who control the smuggling networks that have really kind of blossomed under the sanctions regime. They're the ones who smuggle oil out. They get goods into the country. They deal in the gray area on the black market on foreign currency. The networks extend into Iraq and other places. So they've actually done okay. So I'm not saying the country's in a great place, but that's kind of the bifurcation that you see occurring in society. So what does that mean in terms of, what we're going to like to cover? One other thing I'd mention is that the other thing that's happening, the backstory, the backdrop in Iranian domestic politics is the upcoming transition in the supreme leader's position. Supreme leader is 81 years old. He has had a bout with prostate cancer. Of course, no one knows when that transition will occur. He has a lifetime appointment. But the hardliners in particular, and the system in general, is setting itself up and looking to that transition. And they will want to position themselves to ensure that the next supreme leader is going to also look out after their interests and not mess with a system that has worked out pretty well for the IRGC and its allies. So that's the other backdrop to this discussion. As you referenced, the hardliners have taken control of the parliament in elections last February, and they're gradually moving on other parts of the system. They have their eyes next on the presidential elections next year, and they have a lot of control of the media, and they're expanding their tentacles. And so that'll be the backdrop to any negotiations. And I've dealt with Iran both when we had, under the regime of President Ahmadinejad and then under Rouhani. And it was very different. Under Ahmadinejad, things were very slow going. You had very difficult people on the other side who genuinely believed that they almost wanted to harken back to the golden age, as they viewed it, of Iran, the early days of the Republic when it was under attack, but there was a lot of cohesion internally. And I think they don't realize that kind of the country has moved on. Most of the country was born after the revolution. They don't have these memories any longer. And so, that's the kind of, country we'll be dealing with and the negotiators that we could be encountering when the United States does go back to the table. Very suspicious of the United States, very much insisting they'll ask for compensation, as we talked about. They will basically, demand compliance and a strict adherence to terms, and they want to ensure that whatever is agreed upon will be durable.
Let me ask you a question specifically about sanctions and if and when there's a negotiation with Iran. Before we turn over to some questions, which you can get to us through YouTube chat, Facebook comments, or Zoom if you're tuning in through one of those channels. You mentioned Iran wants an apology and compensation, and the US isn't going to give it to them. Iran also doesn't want to talk about revising the JCPOA. That seems to be off the table, at least now. But if the Biden administration came in, the position has been that if Iran is in compliance, the US would re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. As part of that re-entering, would the US unilaterally, do you think, lift all the banking and oil sanctions that the Trump administration has imposed since May 2018, or would it expect something in return? Or should those sanctions be leverage, or should they be the U.S. putting an opening bid out just to get back in the deal?
Well, thanks. And yeah, again, I don't speak for for any potential future administration, certainly. But as you referenced, Vice President Biden has put out position papers on this. That he argues that if Iran were to return to strict compliance with the nuclear deal, that he would bring the United States back into that agreement. And the agreement, essentially, the terms are pretty clear. There would be under that agreement a lifting of nuclear-related sanctions on Iran. And so that would mean that a lot of the sanctions, particularly as it relates to the oil sector, would come off. But that doesn't sort of mean nirvana from Iran's point of view. You still have some important sanctions that are still left in place. Sanctions that relate to Iran's activities in terrorism, sanctions that relate to human rights, and importantly, sanctions that are there that affect the banking system of Iran. Iran, even before the Trump administration pulled out of the agreement, was under still. It wasn't a period where they felt that they were getting all the sanctions relief that they had hoped for, primarily because they were still denied access to the U.S. banking system, and you had this overhang of U.S. sanctions of enforcement, a process that I was a part of, and my colleagues in the administration, where we basically went out to countries and banks all over the world. And there were so many sanctions on Iran that countries and banks basically just decided, you know what, the cost and the risks of doing business with Iran are just too high. There are too many sanctions to have to sort through. Our compliance departments, are just going to be sorting through too many things. And we may inadvertently do business with somebody who's a front for a bad actor there. And so there was that whole overhang and the muscle memory that was retained from that period. And so even if you lift the oil sanctions, that may not get Iran all the relief it seeks. So I think that, it's in Iran's interest to have something to see more sanctions relief. They will want that. We actually want to see more as well. And that's where you start getting into this discussion of what a broadened agreement might look like, where you bring in other issues that satisfy, more U.S. concerns and can also begin to look at easing some of those sanctions that would still be in place with respect to Iran.
We have a question about the region. You had mentioned the regional dimension to dealing with Iran and the Iran deal. This time around, how much should Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE be consulted on the discussions? As you know, the Iran deal was not well received in Israel. In fact, outright opposed it. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the Gulf states were not pleased with the deal. They didn't voice, like Israel did, their direct opposition. And all three of those countries, important U.S. partners and allies in the region, have been generally supportive of the Trump administration's policy of maximum pressure. Is it important this time around that they play more of a role as a next administration would proceed, especially given the normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE and some of the shared interests between Israel and the Gulf that led to the normalization over the past few years has been a concern about Iran?
Yeah, so I would argue that, yes, there should be good coordination with them. I would actually say that there had been coordination more than people may be aware of previously as well. I remember going to Israel and meeting with their officials on a number of occasions. We also had very high-level contacts with both the Emiratis and the Saudis on the Iranian nuclear threat and the Iranian threat more generally. That was sort of a prominent feature. And I would say that, if you look back at the history, and I think even public reporting will bear this out, that at the time that the JCPOA was signed, you actually had a lot of people in the Israeli security establishment who seemed generally supportive of it. And of course, the political leadership took a different view of things, and that's perfectly within their right. So I think that you will need close coordination with them. They have a lot at stake. All those countries you mentioned view Iran as an existential threat. Israel, in particular, would see an Iranian nuclear weapon as completely unacceptable. We had long conversations with them about that. Israel has said in the past that they won't accept that situation, and they could well take preemptive action. So you have to have decent, not just decent, you have to have close coordination with them. I'd also suggest that, when it comes to the Iranian nuclear issue and U.S. policy towards that, this regional dimension is an important aspect of it. If Iran is a problem today, I would say imagine what Iran would be like if they had a nuclear weapon. They would be completely emboldened. They would have no fear of any kind of response to what they're up to in the region. And so for that reason, keeping them from having a nuclear weapon, I would argue, is very much in the interest of the region and of the countries that you mentioned.
Yes, and I think also with the region, what's important to keep in mind too is many times these regional conflicts drive proliferation issues, and whether because Iran on the one hand, or Saudi Arabia or Israel or others may their own decisions about their national security policy and whether to consider a nuclear option will also be driven by these regional and conflict dynamics. And if they get worse, those choices obviously move closer to the forefront. Let me ask relatedly on thinking through these types of negotiations. The UAE has talked about the US-UAE civil nuclear agreement as the gold standard of US civil nuclear agreements. And one of the reasons is there is no domestic enrichment of uranium in the UAE as a result of that deal. That is also the standard that the Congress would like if US and Saudi Arabia proceed with a civil nuclear agreement. Do you think there's a possibility that the discussion of no enrichment in Iran's nuclear program could be part of the next conversation about the Iranian nuclear program?
Sure, I mean, it certainly could be, and if let's say a second Trump administration is in place, they've made clear that is their policy, is to go to zero enrichment. Now, whether Iran would actually talk to a second Trump administration, I think, would be open to question, but that's the opening position that at least Trump administration would bring. Personally, I don't think it's a very realistic position. Iran is, I would love to see that. I would much prefer to see no enrichment whatsoever in Iran. But the reality is that Iran has had this program for a number of years. It has a lot of scientific know-how that is developed around that. It has, and that knowledge can't be unlearned, if you will. So even if you, let's say, take care of the physical aspects of it, and the JCPOA really did dismantle a big proportion of Iran's actual enrichment capability, if you will, you would still have that knowledge in place, and they could reconstitute. So you can never have full certainty on this. I mean, if you look back at the history of nuclear proliferation, the only times that you see a country moving away from its ambitions is when that country voluntarily makes a decision to do so, through some combination of incentives and disincentives. So with South Africa, for instance. So when it comes to Iran, you know, we are dealing with a reality. This is a country that knows how to enrich, that knows how to produce centrifuges to enrich, that probably knows how to, in the end, even produce a nuclear weapon if they made a determined effort to do so. And so, our effort really has to be focused on minimizing their capability, on constraining it, controlling it, monitoring and verifying it, building everything on the, as President Obama says, on a foundation of mistrust, sort of, changing the old Reagan adage of citing the Russian proverb, mistrust, so verify. That really has to be the approach, that you constrain it. And yes, I would love to see zero enrichment, but let's say we got rid of every last centrifuge in Iran. I would still want to see the kind of robust monitoring and verification system that we have under the JCPOA, because I would not trust that Iran would not try to, let's say, reconstitute that in some way at some point in the future.
We have a question about your point about, and it's your 10th recommendation, developing a durable bipartisan U.S. policy toward Iran. Would you support that the next, or would you advocate, I should say, that the next Iran deal should be a treaty verified by the U.S. Senate?
I don't think that it necessarily needs to be a treaty immediately. If it's something like the JCPOA, that can be a starting point. I do think treaty is one way to make something more durable. There are other ways to do that as well, by arriving at a broader consensus. I think, though, in order to get that broader consensus domestically, you're going to have to broaden the terms somehow of the JCPOA. And there's time to do that, given some of the timelines that are coming up. And of course, if it's a Trump administration that's negotiating, and there are actual discussions, you could see things going in a different direction, which is not JCPOA specifically, but JCPO-like. And again, a treaty would be one way of ensuring some sort of bipartisan consensus. It would be more of a reflection of it as opposed to creating it. But to get to that point, I think you're going to have to broaden the discussion with Iran. And I think Iran actually would have an interest in that, because they've seen what happens when you have partisan disagreement, and things can move rapidly then between when you shift from one administration to another that may take a different view. And that affects then the question you raised earlier of sanctions relief and what investors and what banks do at the end of the day. So I think it's actually in everyone's interest to try to have that broader consensus, something that's more durable. And yes, at the end of the day, you could imagine a treaty, but I would argue that should be reserved for something that is much bigger.
You called for more intensive diplomacy regarding Iraq, in terms of dealing with Iran and addressing these regional issues. The Trump administration, and there seems to be a U.S. consensus, congressional consensus, international consensus to try to support Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi. What more can the U.S. be doing in Iraq, and especially with regard to the challenges the Iraqi government faces in dealing with Iran, and our challenges, American challenges, in dealing with Iran in Iraq?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. And Iraq better than anybody, having done a lot of your original dissertation work on the country, and so I always look to you as an expert on that subject. I think it's interesting with Iraq today. My sense, and I'd be really curious about your thoughts on it, is that Iraq's at an interesting inflection point, if you will. And I look in particular at the combination of a couple of things. One is the fact that you have a serious person in Mustafa al-Kadhimi as the prime minister. You have a serious president in Barham Saleh. And they are in power at an interesting moment, months after the so-called October Revolution, which brought Iraqis of all sects and ethnicities to the streets. People were frustrated, and they continue to be, over the rampant corruption in the system. They are frustrated over Iran's interference in their internal affairs. A lot of those protests had a very strong, overt anti-Iran component to them. And they're upset about the militia, many of whom are backed by Iran. And they, of course, the militia cross between those two problems, the corruption and the Iranian interference. And so there is certainly that strong sentiment on the street. And I think the kinds of things that the United States could do would be, first of all, to stop treating Iraq as if it's a battlefield primarily between Iran and the United States. That doesn't help Iraq at all. Iraq is a neighbor to Iran. They're going to have a relationship, no matter what we say. And I think we have to recognize that. That said, over time, if we can help Iraq emerge as somewhat of a counterweight, if we can help it develop on its own terms and not be part of this, emerging sort of set of axes in the region, that I think is a positive thing for the United States. If you really look around, there's really nothing that approximates the kind of, emerging, it's a very flawed, I don't want to call it a full democracy because it's very flawed in many ways, but there are elections, there's a democratic polity, there's a parliament, prime ministers have come and gone, they have to be responsive to the population. And so we should be looking to support that government, help it in its efforts to bring the militia under control, help it in particular on its anti-corruption efforts, and also be sensitive to questions about their sovereignty. And of course, we have troops who are operating there for a very important reason, to take on ISIS. Iran, of course, has pledged after the killing of Qasem Soleimani to drive U.S. forces out of Iraq. They've had a long-standing policy of driving forces out of the region. We have our interests there as well. And so we have to be sensitive to Iraq's own political environment, and we have to be a good partner. That's what I would say.
Indeed, I think you're exactly right. And I think going back to your methodology in the Iran report, one of the things we should be thinking about with Iraq is the scenario of what if Iraq, struggles given the economic challenges, the political challenges. Could the U.S., what would be the implications for the United States in the region? It is something that is a major national security concern. And as you mentioned, the leadership, the president and prime minister of Iraq are trying to point to Iraq as a bridge, not a battlefield in the region. And that's an ambition worth supporting. As we're winding down toward the end of the hour, I want to get at least one more question in. You talked about human rights. How realistic is it to negotiate human rights with Iran? They obviously don't like to talk about that. They don't like to talk about it with the United States. Of course, we agree it should be talked about. But while you're trying to negotiate a civil nuclear agreement, or a nuclear agreement, I should say.
So I think this is a case where you have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Obviously, the strategic priority with Iran is the nuclear program, as I laid out at the beginning. That has to be the highest priority we have with Iran. But it doesn't mean you ignore other things. We have to remember who we are as a country. My own hope is that we get back to some of those core values here domestically as well. I think that puts us in a stronger position, not only with respect to Iran, but more generally across the world. If we're doing a good job in advancing our civil rights, we're in a stronger position as well. But Iran's human rights record has been abysmal, and I don't think it can be ignored. I think you have to distinguish it, as I said, from any hint of, trying to use that as a lever for regime change. It's just a fact, and we have to recognize it. And we've done it not just in Iran, but with countries around the world, whether it's Hong Kong or Ukraine or Belarus. We've always stood for those things, and we wouldn't be who we are if we don't. But that said, there's a Iran believes that our policy from the get-go, even under President Obama, even under previous presidents who they were, occasionally have dealings with, was always regime change. They believe the United States wants to overthrow their system. And that's not to say that we should, we can ever affect that mindset. But it does mean that we have to be very clear in what we say in our rhetoric, that we do stand for universal rights in Iran, just as we would for those rights anywhere else. And we should be willing to take action, ideally multilaterally, with other democracies who could stand with us. And I think, the Iranian people understand that, and they will see that. And actually, whatever the government may say, I think they pay attention to this. I think they have a responsibility to respond to those things. They will pay attention, and even if you make a little bit of a difference, that can go a long way in terms of making life better for a lot of Iranians who aren't living in a particularly great situation.
Puneet, we've reached about the end of our hour. I want to thank the Asia Society Policy Institute, Tom Nagorski, your team there, Morgan and Oscar, and you, and congratulations on a really well done, timely report on how the U.S. should be dealing with Iran. I really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you for including me in it as well.
Thanks very much, Andrew. This was great. You know a lot about the region, and it was just a pleasure to have this back and forth and to hear some of your thoughts on this as well.
Pleasure was mine, and thanks to everyone who tuned in today. And this should be available as a link on the Asia Society website, if I'm correct, right, Puneet?
That's right. On the Asia Society Policy Institute website, we will have it available.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.